Hey folks, I'm your host BKP. Good morning from the office, North Georgia's only live online morning show. And we've had several of the candidates, Republican candidates for governor on with us, and this is the first time. We're joined now by candidate for Georgia Governor, former Navy SEAL, three-time national champion swimmer, businessman Clay Tippins. Mr. Tippins, how are you this morning?
Morning, how are y'all?
Let me ask you a question. Let's just go right into this because it is, when you're running for office, this is the first time you've run for any public office, is that correct?
That's right.
So you've not run for any public office, so you're probably already aware of this, but every day a new subject may come up or something happen that calls for a response. Yesterday, the Mississippi Governor, Phil Bryant, signed into law which is being held up by a federal judge right now, but he signed into the law the nation's toughest abortion ban called the Gestational Age Act, 15 weeks from the time of conception, which your opponents, Hunter Hill, Mike Williams, and Brian Kemp, have already come out and made statements in favor and supporting the governor in Mississippi, and even Kemp saying he would even sign the toughest in the nation. I didn't see any comments from you yet. Has your campaign made a comment concerning this bill yesterday, and would you like to do that now?
Yeah, we put one out yesterday, and I'm glad to share with your audience. Look, I have long believed that life begins at conception, and I think what you see reflected in that law, that science increasingly, confirms that.
So you support the governor of Mississippi signing that bill, and if a similar bill came to you as the governor of Georgia, you would sign something resembling that bill?
One of the things I've made very clear on other issues, whether it's tag pledges or whatever, is I'm not going to be making pledges to sign, legislation I haven't seen the final draft of. But what I can share with you is my family is a faith family. We're Christians. We believe that life begins at conception, and I think this science increasingly, is reflecting that it's moving towards that belief. So, I'd have to look at the final legislation then, but I am pro-life, yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Moving into the budget, because you have made a statement, and I looked at your Facebook page and your issues on your website, that you would be interested in cutting the state budget $2 to $3 billion. Let me just say this: the state budget, obviously, has just in the 5 years, we're just using the last 5 years, has averaged an increase over $1 billion a year in 5 years, like 5.5. How would you cut the budget? Where would you cut the budget? And what does that look like in your administration as governor?
So I'll go to the three examples right off the bat. They're each worth a few $100 million a piece, and then I'll tell you some of the other things that I think, are going to happen regardless. First of all, if you read the previous year's budgets, we've got about 15,000 state employees that become retirement eligible in the next 3 or 4 years. It's roughly 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 of the state employed. And this is due to baby boomers in retirement age. And in the history of our state, really in the history of any government in America, be it state or federal, we've never had a window of time where so many employees all at one time hit retirement age and voluntarily retired. I think it's truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to not just shrink government, but to transform government, to shift priorities around, to take a hard look at these jobs, not replace all of them, consolidate some of them, and move some of them to more impactful areas. I talk a lot about early reading. I think it's a great chance to bolster, head count in classroom of teachers, first, second, third grade, for example. If you look at just steering into 15,000 state employees voluntarily retiring, roughly all at the same time, it's a real once-in-a-generation chance for someone like me with a business background to do something constructive with that. And my opponents, they've got different backgrounds. A lot of them spent a lot of years in politics, but none of them spent a lot of years, in the sort of business background I have. And that's one of the things that I believe makes me uniquely qualified. Another opportunity, I think, that sits in front of us really in the next 4 or 5 years is we've got this unprecedented ability to use data and analytics to make stuff run better, smarter, cheaper, and faster. And I'll give you an example. You look at 70–80% of all our dollars go to entitlement programs. And I took a hard look at disability fraud, for example. And the reason I focus on disability fraud is there are people who secure entitlements for completely valid and righteous reasons. That's what that safety net's for. But there should not be fraud in that, and there's way too much of that. And if you look at disability fraud, for example, there's people that go in and complain of pain. And in some cases, they could be working and they, get prescribed opium pills, for example. And if you look at this, I went and studied it. There are 20 counties in Georgia that have 3 times the state average of their working age adults on disability. If you look at where those 20 counties are, 17 of them are contiguous. It's 4 clusters around the state. You can look at it in 10 seconds, realize it's not a natural pattern. In some cases, that's waste, fraud, and abuse. And if we take a hard look at some of things like that, I think that we could limit disability fraud. We could look at limiting fraud and other types of entitlements. We could limit overprescription of opium pills. And I think we'd end up with a Georgia that's a few $100 million a year cheaper. We got less opium pill prescription, and that would lead to fewer heroin overdoses and deaths from that. And again, as someone that used data to map out networks and behavior patterns as both a SEAL and in business, I think I'm uniquely qualified to do that. So those together, that's probably worth, somewhere near $1 billion a year. If you look at Governor Deal's budgets over the past few years, we've collected, on average, about $500 million more, give or take, than we've actually planned on collecting and spending. So that's $1.5 billion. If you look at the tax benefits from President Trump's tax cut, if we plowed all that into a tax deduction, that's about $1 billion a year. So you can quickly see a path to that $2 or $3 billion if you look at it like a business person would. And I think that's a unique ability that I bring to this race.
Well, let me ask you a question. I watched several of your interviews, and just like religious liberty, and much like the abortion question I brought up earlier, I respect that you say that you're not going to comment or sign pledges on legislation that's not on your desk, hypothetical legislation. Then let me turn that around. How would you, because as the governor, you get to take before session what you hope to achieve, your legislative agenda that you would like to see on your desk. So how would you propose to the leadership that you would want to have this retirement not replaced through agencies? What kind of bill would that look like? Of what would the requirement be to rehire once these government employees retire? Because you would have agencies and people say, well, we need to refill these positions. What kind of bill would you put in place that said, hey, before these are filled again, they have to go through this process or whatever? So how would you ensure that these agencies wouldn't rehire these positions?
One of the things that I have long believed about government is it's slow and it's not fluid. This is one of the few cases where we could use that on itself. We could put checks in place where, operational measures in place where before rehiring a retiring position, there's a, could you do this with technology? It has to be justified when it can be consolidated with a similar role. It has to be held up for comparison against a list of higher priority jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Why can it not be replaced by, can we, for example, have other people in the department that are more junior do the role? I think we could look at putting bonus and incentives in places where government employees, they achieve metrics and benefits based on their ability to perform to higher service levels with fewer tax dollars spent. Again, these are very, very typical standard things that you see done in businesses that work very effectively. And what you often see is you can see budgets shrink, service levels go up, and pride and satisfaction by folks that work in those departments go up along with it. And, those are some of the things I've been successful doing in business. And I think that that's very, very well suited to what opportunities our Georgia has in the next few years.
Let me ask you this. Let me switch gears on tax abatements. We have we have a lot of companies that have come to Georgia that have enjoyed good tax deals and special deals to come and relocate in Georgia. Right now, what kind of deal would a Governor Tippins approve of to bring Amazon? Do you agree with trying to bring Amazon to Georgia? What kind of deal would you put on the table as the governor? And where do you stand on HQ2?
So, Ryan, indulge me for a second. You know, I've been at those tables when those sorts of deals got put together, so I really do know the ins and outs of how those contracts are done. I've made decisions about, you know, life and death, those sorts of things, you know, combat situations. One of the things that I'm very careful of is to say, here's the commander's intent, but to be careful with details because details matter. You know, first of all, I can't possibly tell you what my incentive package would look like for an Amazon deal because I have no idea once you get inside that thing how many of those 50,000 jobs are hard committed and how many of them are soft targets. You can't price something out unless you know what it's worth. I can tell you that I'm sure they're not all hard targets because, again, I've been in those sorts of negotiations before. But should we go after the Amazons? Of course we should. We should come up with a fair price tag that reflects what we really expect to get from it, not what we hope to get from it. So that's number one. The second thing that I'll say on Amazon, and I'll shift to tax deals and general tax credits, tax abatements, and what a Tippins rule would look like. You know, there's other things that I think Georgia could sell, for example, besides dollars up front. What Amazon is into, why they are such a successful company, is innovation, autonomous delivery, drone delivery. Well, you look at some of the assets that the Metro Atlanta area has. Take a Fort McPherson, for example. When I hear Fort McPherson, I think that's an innovation sandbox. We could go to many of the great technology companies and say, come to Georgia. Don't just bring your jobs here. Prove how autonomous driving works. If you're going to have to fail and wreck something, do it in a Fort McPherson area, for example. Come and prove out drone delivery. The way we can be the 21st century state is sell our state as an innovation sandbox where people come to build innovation and build whole new models, not just bring jobs. If we were to shift for a minute to what the Tippins rule would look like for tax credits, I'd give you sort of a 3-point thing. One, they should be rare. Number two, they should have real ROI, taking into consideration things like what's promised and what's hoped for. And the third is they should be applied in an even way wherever possible. You know, for example, I think the movie tax credit's been a good thing for our state. That's brought industry here. It doesn't unfairly benefit one company over another. I would have opposed out of the chute the Delta tax credit, for example. We need to take care of our Georgia corporations. We need to make them a great place to do business, including Delta. But I feel like that particular tax break at this point in time, where they're doing as well as they would have given that corporation, which is a wonderful Georgia company, a benefit that other companies wouldn't have gotten. And I don't think that would have been right. I mean, I'm pro Second Amendment, but I think Delta should never have been looking at getting that tax break regardless. It should never have been on the table.
Yeah, so but actually, I don't mean to interrupt you, but actually that tax break being labeled the Delta tax break is actually the aviation jet fuel tax break that everyone that had jet fuel, regardless if you're in Union County, Georgia, that break. So isn't that not that you're trying to mislead, that don't take that wrong, but sometimes when we hear the Delta tax break, isn't that a little misleading in a way?
Here's how I look at this. Let's say I tell you I had a birthday party and everybody there got birthday cake and one or two people came from of all my friends. That's a little bit different. You know what I'm saying?
All right. Okay. All right. All right.
I mean, Brian.
No,
really,
I understand. I understand what you're saying. It's not you, sir. It's just actually I've heard Delta tax break, and I kind of, every once in a while I think, well, I just want to make sure it's clear. It was the aviation jet fuel tax break. That but Delta was the largest recipient of $40-some million. I agree with that.
And that's my point is. I feel like that particular break would have disproportionately benefited one over many. That was my issue with it.
All right. Well, let me ask you. Let me change gears because we're getting a lot in. I appreciate it. Rural Georgia. We're in North Georgia here. We're the 515 corridor starting north and how would you convince the people in North Georgia and in rural Georgia that you would be a governor for rural Georgia and not Atlanta? Sometimes there's the two Georgias. Tell us right now why we should believe that Clay Tippins, the next governor, possible governor of Georgia, would be good for rural Georgia.
Well, it's a couple, three things. If you look at some of, and I'm not going to talk about North Georgia over South Georgia in a rural perspective, but if you look at in general, what are some of the things that the next governor can do that would benefit rural Georgia? Number one, we've got to accelerate the rate at which we're dredging the Savannah Port. That's something I had an urgent and unique voice on. I put forward specific plans, as we covered earlier in this podcast, on what we can do to shrink budget and create headspace under the budget for key investments. And I think that putting more money towards accelerating the dredging the Savannah Port is one of the most important infrastructure investments we can make. That's going to benefit our agriculture, our forestry sectors. That's going to have a great lift and benefit on rural Georgia. It's going to create commerce coming all up that I-16 corridor. So that'd be number one. Number two, we need to invest in rural broadband coverage. As someone that ran a large technology business with a focus on telecommunications, again, I've got a unique background to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used with the greatest stewardship and frugality to bring greater coverage to unserved areas through public-private partnerships, and do so in ensuring that it doesn't become a corporate giveaway. Again, that's something I'm uniquely well suited for based on my business background. The other thing that I've talked about and I've focused on a lot is early reading. We've got 2/3 of our third graders not reading at a third grade level. And if you look at some of the things that we can do to really boost all of Georgia, it's improving third grade reading, which will have a cascading effect through our entire workforce. And the final thing, and again, these last two things sound general, but they are very, very impactful. The opioid addiction. We prescribed 541 million pills in Georgia in a 12-month period of time. That is awful. It's unacceptable. And if we tackle that thing using some of the approaches I've talked about, with analytics, and figure out where there's more of that and choke that down, that's not just going to increase the quality of our labor pool. It's going to increase the health of our communities, and that, with the rural broadband and telemedicine, could really help our health care in rural Georgia as well.
What specifically separates you from the other candidates on the Republican side of this race? What is the clear separation that you have that the other four candidates do not have, or what you offer is the reason people should look to vote for Clay Tippins?
First of all, every other one of these candidates has spent a lot of time in politics. There's almost 50 years of combined political experience between them. Folks are going to get to decide on May 22nd. Do they think that makes people better suited at this day and time to be governor, or worse? I clearly concluded that we sit at this moment in time where the opportunities and challenges, we need different type of thinking in order to future-proof the state. So that's the first. Second thing is, I've got the most executive management experience in this race. The other candidates have done various and sundry things, but they do not have, significant executive experience. And I think that makes me uniquely well suited to lead on some of these things that we've talked about, like reducing the budget. The third thing is, with my Navy SEAL background, I've been successful, overseas with hunting down networks of bad guys. And that's a unique skill set. Metro Atlanta is the #1 place in America for sex trafficking. #1, $300 million business alone. And your human trafficking networks, your sex trafficking networks, are very, very tied in to heroin networks, illegal gun networks, MS-13 networks. And I put together specific plans to use those targeting skills to take that down. When we do so, it will kill this scourge that's hurting our state in sex trafficking, and it'll put a hell of a hurting on your heroin networks, your illegal gun networks, your MS-13 networks. And that would be a good thing I'm uniquely well suited to do based on my background.
Have you looked at any of the new Florida legislation that's been passed concerning different background checks on guns, raising the age, some of the things that have been done in the state of Florida since the Parkland shooting? Have you looked at any of that? And have you looked at Georgia and where we're at on school safety and anything where that's concerned?
Yeah, and this, I think, obviously became a point of interest during the Delta NRA thing. I'm pro Second Amendment, I'm pro gun. You expect that from a Navy SEAL. So that's number one, is I think that is part of our state. As a private citizen, I wish the corporations wouldn't get into politics and that sort of thing, just to kind of tie back to the Delta thing earlier. Second thing, if you look at the Second Amendment, well, were we given that by our forefathers? Not just to protect us from governments, but from failures of government. And when you look at the tragedy that happened in Florida, there were so many places along the way that tragedy could have been avoided. The FBI had several points that they were given heads up and failed to interdict. The sheriff's department deputy was given several points. The deputy stood outside while shots are fired and didn't stop it. And certainly, as governor of Georgia, I would do everything within my power to correct those sorts of failures of government and prevent those and keep that from happening. If you look at some of the measures that have been considered, within schools, President Trump's agenda to provide teachers who are qualified to shoot, carry weapons, to opt in on a voluntary basis, absolutely we should look at that. If you have, let's take a former Marine, for example, with combat skills that says, I'm a licensed concealed carry person, is qualified to do that, why would we not want that person inside that school if a Parkland tragedy were to occur here inside Georgia? If you look at, some of the measures been contemplated, metal detectors, a metal detector is not going to stop that unless there's a school guard there reinforcing that. I think that we should look at making, state monies available, appropriation, for example, for local school districts to exercise discretion and control to, bolster defenses with school guards and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of things that a Governor Tippins would look at doing to bolster school safety while maintaining our precious Second Amendment rights.
Well, I know we've used up all the time. We told your office, your staff, that we would do this more. We usually try to keep them within 30 minutes. We appreciate you taking the time. I got two really quick things.
Sure.
How important? Because I've been going through the campaign finance. How important is it? Millions of dollars. These campaigns and obviously it's not just you. These campaigns now for governor and senator and representatives are going into astronomical numbers now. How important is it to look through these candidates' campaign finance reports and see where some of the money's coming from?
Well, I think you framed it out a bit in terms of the amount of money to be raised and how important it is to look at disclosures. For me, the reason disclosures are relevant is any potential conflict of interest thing. I think that all the candidates are going to have to raise the amount of money they need to get their message out there, tell Georgia voters why they're the person. So I think in a way that looking at the personal finances is what they can raise is potentially separate. I think the important thing on disclosures is what are their financial interests.
Okay, you support the President of the United States. You support Donald Trump?
I do.
Okay. Where could I find, because in fairness to you, Mr. Tippins, I went through all the Facebook pages, the candidate Facebook pages, and I did not see the statement there, and I don't want to leave that out. Where can I find the statement that you made concerning the Mississippi governor signing the abortion law yesterday? You said your campaign released a statement. Is that something you put on your website that I can find?
It was on, I think it was the AJC. It ran, I think, last night.
Okay, we'll look that up. Well, Mr. Tippins, we appreciate it. We'd like to have you back anytime you're available. Anytime with the candidates, and we appreciate you being with us this morning.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Clay Tippins, a three-time national swimming champion and former Navy SEAL businessman running for governor here in Georgia. I'm going to take a brief break, and we'll come back and go over the interview here just a little bit, just recap a little of that, and then get into some more of the national news that we have that we've been talking about. Take us to break, Amanda.